August 31, 1944. Somewhere east of Verdun, near the River Meuse, an American Sherman tank sat still in the heat of late summer. Its engine was silent. Its tracks were packed with the white dust of French roads. Its crew had crossed more of France in a few weeks than most armies in history had crossed in entire campaigns. They had come through Normandy, through shattered towns, through crossroads still smelling of burned fuel and cordite, through villages where civilians waved from doorways and German prisoners marched west in long gray columns. Now they were stopped, not because the Germans had stopped them, not because their tank had been knocked out, not because the crew had lost its nerve. They were stopped because the fuel gauge read empty. The tank belonged to one of the American armored formations driving east after the breakout from Normandy. Across the front, the same problem was appearing everywhere. Sherman tanks sat along the shoulders of French roads with dry fuel tanks. Half-tracks waited in fields because there was no gasoline to move them. Artillery batteries still had shells, but the trucks that pulled their guns and carried their ammunition were running low. Infantrymen, who had spent weeks watching the German army retreat, now sat beside the road and asked why the chase had stopped. The answer was not in front of them. The answer was hundreds of miles behind them, on the beaches of Normandy, where the supplies were piled high and where the army no longer had enough transport to bring them forward fast enough. The American army had outrun its own lifeline. This was not supposed to happen so soon. The Allied invasion plan, Operation Overlord, had been one of the most detailed military plans ever written. Its logistical schedules calculated fuel, food, ammunition, spare parts, hospital beds, replacement troops, and transport capacity day by day. It assumed that the Allied armies would advance steadily across France. It did not assume that the German front would collapse as rapidly as it did after the breakout from Normandy. The plan had expected progress. What it got was victory at a speed that broke the plan. By late August 1944, American and British forces had advanced far beyond many of the timetable assumptions made before D-Day. The German army in France had been badly mauled. Its formations had been battered in Normandy and nearly destroyed in the Falaise Pocket and forced into a desperate retreat toward the German border. To the men at the front, it looked as if one more hard push might carry them into Germany. But armies do not move on courage alone. They move on fuel, they move on tires, spark plugs, replacement engines, rations, artillery, shells, maps, radio batteries, blood plasma, and millions of gallons of gasoline. Every tank moving east needed fuel. Every truck carrying that fuel needed fuel of its own. Every mile gained by the front added another mile to the supply route behind it. And by the last days of August, the distance between the beaches and the battlefield had become the greatest enemy the Allies faced. At German headquarters in the West, senior officers understood this problem very well. Field Marshal Walter Model, recently appointed to command German forces in the West, had spent much of the war trying to hold collapsing fronts together. He had fought on the Eastern Front, where supply lines could decide the fate of entire armies. German staff officers had been trained to think in terms of the culminating point of an offensive, the moment when an attacking army could no longer sustain its own advance. Beyond that point, even a victorious army could become vulnerable because its strength at the front no longer matched the demands placed on its rear. To German eyes, the Americans appeared to be approaching that point. The Americans had broken out of Normandy. They had raced across France. They had driven the Germans backward with astonishing speed. But now their fuel was running out. Their supply lines were stretched. Their ports were inadequate, their railways were broken, their trucks were wearing down. German commanders had seen this pattern before. Napoleon had learned it in Russia. The German army had learned it on the road to Moscow. Now, they believed the Americans were about to learn it in France. That judgment was not foolish. It was a professional military assessment based on centuries of experience. No army could keep advancing forever if the supplies did not follow. A tank without gasoline was just a steel box. A division without ammunition was only a crowd of tired men. A pursuit that could not be supplied would stop. And if it stopped, the Germans would have time to recover. That was the hope in German headquarters in the last days of August 1944. The Americans had gone too far, too fast. The Germans believed the Allied advance would exhaust itself. They were partly right, and then they were proven wrong in a way they did not expect. The crisis had begun with victory. In late July 1944, General Omar Bradley's 1st U.S. Army launched Operation Cobra. For weeks after D-Day, American forces had been trapped in the brutal hedgerow country of Normandy. The terrain favored defense. German units fought from sunken lanes, fields bordered by thick hedges, and villages turned into strongpoints. Every road junction had to be taken. Every field could hide an anti-tank gun. Progress was slow and expensive. Cobra was meant to break that deadlock. On July 25, after a massive aerial bombardment south of St. Lo, American infantry and armor punched through the German line. The bombing devastated German positions, especially the Panzerlehr Division, though some bombs also fell short onto American troops. Among the Americans killed was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, one of the highest-ranking U.S. officers to die in Europe during the war. The cost was terrible, but the effect was decisive. The German front cracked. Once the Americans were through the hedgerows, the war changed shape. What had been a grinding battle of fields and villages became a pursuit across open country. Patton's Third Army, activated in France on August 1, drove with extraordinary speed. Armored columns bypassed German pockets, crossed rivers, seized towns, and moved so fast that maps became outdated almost as soon as they were printed. The German army in France was not merely retreating. In many sectors, it was disintegrating. Every mile of that pursuit carried a hidden cost. The Allied supply system had been built around Normandy. The beaches were still the main base. Cherbourg, captured in late June, had been badly damaged by the Germans before surrendering and could not immediately handle the enormous tonnage planners had expected. Other major ports were still unavailable. Le Havre remained in German hands until September. Brest would fall later, but it was so badly wrecked that it never became the useful supply port the Allies had hoped for. Antwerp, one of the greatest ports in Europe, would be captured intact on September 4, but the shelled estuary leading to it would remain under German control for weeks, making the port useless to Allied shipping until late November. The railways were no better. Before D-Day, Allied air forces had attacked the French rail network to prevent German reinforcements from reaching Normandy. The plan worked. German reserves were delayed, and Normandy was not reinforced as quickly as the German command wanted. But now the same destruction that had helped the invasion made it difficult to supply the pursuit. Bridges were down, rail yards were damaged, track was broken, signals were wrecked. French railway workers were doing what they could, but the system could not be restored overnight. That left the roads. Everything had to move by truck: fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts, replacement equipment. All of it had to be loaded in Normandy and driven forward over roads that grew longer every day. The American Army had trucks, more trucks than any army in history had ever possessed. But even the American Army had not planned for a pursuit moving this far, this fast, with railways and ports unable to carry the burden. The trucks that should have been making short and medium hauls were forced into exhausting long-distance runs. Drivers were pushed past normal limits. Vehicles wore out. Tires failed. Engines overheated. Maintenance schedules collapsed. By late August, the front was in danger of stopping. Patton knew it. Bradley knew it. Eisenhower knew it. And the men responsible for the rear area knew it most of all. One of those men was Lieutenant General John C.H. Lee, commander of the Communications Zone, known as CMZ. Lee's organization controlled much of the rear area supply structure of the American forces in Europe. He was a controversial figure, deeply religious, strict, ambitious, and disliked by many combat commanders. Soldiers mocked his initials, JCH, by calling him Jesus Christ himself. His headquarters was often criticized as too large, too comfortable, and too far removed from the mud and exhaustion of the front. But Lee also understood logistics. He knew the pursuit would fail unless a new emergency supply system was created immediately. The normal methods were not enough. Rail could not yet carry the load. Ports were not ready. The armies needed fuel now, not in a month. So Kiam's officers began building an improvised solution. The solution became known as the Red Ball Express. The name came from American railroad slang. A red ball freight car meant priority cargo. It was to be moved first, cleared through junctions, and delayed by nothing. The phrase was simple, recognizable, and perfect for what the Army now needed. Priority freight, do not stop, do not delay. Move the supplies forward. The Red Ball Express took shape in late August 1944 and was operating as the major emergency supply route by August 25. It was not a normal convoy system. It was a military road network stripped down to one purpose: push supplies from Normandy to the front as fast as possible. The system used one-way routes. Loaded trucks drove east on one set of roads. Empty trucks returned west on another. Civilian traffic was cleared away. Military police controlled intersections. Signs marked the route with red discs. Trucks were ordered to keep moving at steady intervals. The goal was not elegance. The goal was movement. At first, the main route ran from the Normandy supply areas toward Chartres. As the front moved, the route extended farther east. Eventually, Red Ball trucks were running across hundreds of miles of French roads toward forward depots closer to the armies. It became less a convoy than a moving artery, a mechanical bloodstream carrying the fuel and supplies that kept the Allied advance alive. The trucks were mostly the famous 2.5-ton cargo trucks, especially the GMC CCKW, known to soldiers as the Deuce and a Half or the Jimmy. These vehicles became one of the quiet symbols of Allied victory. They were not glamorous. They were not tanks. They were not fighter planes. They did not appear in dramatic battlefield paintings. But without them, the armies could not move. The Deuce and a Half was rugged, simple, and mass-produced. It could carry heavy loads over rough roads, and in practice it often carried more than its rated load. Drivers loaded the trucks with gasoline cans, ammunition crates, rations, and whatever else the front demanded. The trucks were driven hard, often far beyond what maintenance officers would have considered reasonable in peacetime. In a normal army, that kind of usage would have destroyed the transport system. In the American Army, it nearly did, but American industry could replace trucks, parts, tires, and engines on a scale the German Army could not match. The difference between the two armies was not just tactical, it was industrial. By 1944, the United States had become a nation capable of producing trucks, ships, tanks, aircraft fuel, ammunition, and spare parts in quantities that changed what was possible in war. The German army had pioneered modern armored warfare, but it never fully escaped dependence on horses. Even late in the war, German supply columns still relied heavily on animal transport. American formations in Europe, by contrast, were overwhelmingly motorized. That difference mattered. A German commander could understand tanks, artillery, and battlefield maneuver, but the scale of American motor transport was harder to grasp because it represented a different kind of power. It was not just military power. It was industrial power turned into movement. And on the Red Ball Express, that power was placed in the hands of men the American Army itself had underestimated. A large majority of the drivers on the Red Ball Express were African American soldiers. Most served in segregated quartermaster truck companies. In 1944, the U.S. Army was still segregated. Black soldiers wore the uniform, served under the flag, crossed the ocean, and risked their lives, but they were often denied combat roles and pushed into labor, transport, engineering, and supply units. The official assumptions behind that policy were racist and wrong. Yet by a bitter irony, the survival of the Allied pursuit across France depended heavily on these very men. The Army did not fully trust them to fight at the front. Then it gave them the job of keeping the front alive. They drove the trucks that carried the gasoline for Patton's tanks, the ammunition for American artillery, the rations for infantrymen, and the medical supplies for field hospitals. They drove through darkness, fog, rain, dust, air alerts, mechanical breakdowns, and exhaustion. They drove on roads crowded with military traffic and scarred by war. They drove through towns where bridges were damaged, signs were missing, and the front seemed to move every day. Many drove for 20 hours at a time. Some drove even longer. The system often used 2 drivers per truck. One drove while the other tried to sleep in the cab. But sleeping in a moving army truck was not real rest. The roads were rough. The engines were loud. The danger was constant. A man might close his eyes for a few minutes, only to wake when the truck lurched, braked, or nearly collided with another vehicle. The Red Ball Express was not a clean line of heroic trucks rolling smoothly across France. It was chaotic, exhausting, dangerous work. Drivers ate cold rations because there was no time to stop. They slept under trucks, in cabs, or beside the road. They repaired vehicles with whatever tools and parts they could find. They pushed trucks beyond normal limits because the front needed supplies immediately. Military police urged them forward. Dispatchers demanded tonnage. Combat units waited for fuel. The road itself became an enemy. Accidents were common. Trucks overturned in darkness. Drivers fell asleep at the wheel. Vehicles collided in fog or dust. Overloaded trucks broke axles and burned clutches and blew tires. Gasoline trucks were especially dangerous. A single spark could turn a vehicle into a fireball. Men died not in dramatic charges, but in ditches, in crushed cabs, under rolled vehicles, or in fires that spread too fast for anyone to help. There were also German air attacks, though by late 1944, the Luftwaffe was far weaker than it had once been. Even a weakened Luftwaffe could still kill truck drivers on exposed roads. Strafing attacks, night harassment, and bombing of depots added to the danger. The drivers were not always close to the front line, but they were never entirely safe. Then there was theft and the black market. Gasoline was precious. So were cigarettes, food, clothing, and spare parts. In liberated France and Belgium, American supplies could be traded for cash, wine, favors, or goods. Some soldiers stole from loads, some diverted fuel. Some sold cigarettes. Military police tried to stop it, and some men were punished. But the Red Ball Express was too large, too fast, and too improvised for perfect control. The system leaked, but it also worked. That was the remarkable thing. Despite exhaustion, accidents, mechanical failure, traffic confusion, overloading, theft, and constant pressure, the Red Bull Express moved staggering quantities of supplies. At its peak, thousands of trucks were running the route. On some days, more than 12,000 tons of supplies moved forward. Over the course of the operation, more than 400,000 tons were delivered. The German staff officers had expected the Americans to reach a point where their advance could not be sustained. They were not wrong about the problem. They were wrong about the American answer. The answer was not a perfect plan. The answer was improvisation on an industrial scale. At the front, however, the crisis still felt real. Patton's Third Army reached the Meuse in late August and early September, but fuel shortages repeatedly slowed or stopped its advance. Patton believed that if he had been given enough gasoline, he could have driven deeper, faster, perhaps even into Germany, before the Germans could form a stable defense. His diary and later statements showed deep frustration. He believed opportunity was being lost not because of German resistance, but because of Allied supply decisions. There was truth in his frustration. There was also more to the story. Eisenhower faced a strategic dilemma. The Allies were advancing on a broad front. Montgomery's 21st Army Group was moving through Belgium toward the Netherlands. Bradley's 12th Army Group, including Hodges's 1st Army and Patton's 3rd Army, was pushing east toward Germany. Supplies were not sufficient to support every army at full speed at the same time. Someone had to receive priority. In early September, Eisenhower leaned toward supporting a northern thrust, and partly because Antwerp had been captured, and partly because Montgomery proposed a bold operation through the Netherlands. That plan became Operation Market Garden, launched on September 17. It aimed to seize a chain of bridges leading toward the Rhine, with airborne divisions landing ahead of British armored forces. If successful, it might open a route into northern Germany and perhaps shorten the war. The operation failed. The bridge at Arnhem could not be held. The British 1st Airborne Division suffered devastating losses. The corridor proved too narrow, the German resistance stronger than expected, and the timetable too ambitious. Market Garden became one of the great Allied disappointments of the campaign. For Patton and his supporters, the failure confirmed what they already believed. Fuel had been diverted away from the army that could have used it best. In their view, Third Army had been stopped just when it had the chance to break into Germany. But history is rarely that simple. Patton's army was brilliant in pursuit, but it also depended on roads, bridges, fuel, ammunition, and flank security. The German border defenses, including the West Wall or Siegfried Line, still existed. The terrain ahead was more difficult than the roads across central France. German resistance was stiffening. Weather was worsening. Supply lines were still stretched. Even if Patton had received more fuel, it is not certain he could have ended the war in 1944. It is possible, it is not proven. That distinction matters. The Red Ball Express kept the American armies moving, but it could not completely solve every Allied supply problem. It was an emergency system, and emergency systems have limits. It consumed enormous amounts of fuel simply to move supplies forward. Trucks used gasoline to carry gasoline. The longer the route became, the more costly it was to sustain. Vehicles wore out at alarming rates. Maintenance units struggled to keep them running. Drivers became exhausted. The roads could not carry infinite traffic. The Red Ball Express bought time. It did not abolish distance. The real long-term solution was not more trucking from Normandy. The real solution was a major port closer to the front. That port was Antwerp. Antwerp was captured by British forces on September 4, 1944, largely intact. This was a major prize. Its docks, cranes, warehouses, and rail connections could potentially transform Allied logistics. With Antwerp open, supplies would no longer have to travel hundreds of miles from Normandy. They could be unloaded much closer to the front. But Antwerp had a problem. A port is useless if ships cannot reach it. The city lies inland, connected to the North Sea by the Scheldt estuary. German forces still controlled positions along that waterway. As long as German guns and mines threatened the estuary, Allied cargo ships could not safely enter Antwerp. Capturing the city was not enough. The approaches had to be cleared. That task fell largely to the 1st Canadian Army. The Battle of the Scheldt was one of the hardest and least glamorous campaigns in Northwest Europe. It was fought in miserable terrain, flooded polders, mud, canals, dikes, and fortified villages. Canadian, British, and Polish troops fought through German defenses in conditions that turned movement into agony. Amphibious assaults were needed. Dikes were breached. Water flooded the battlefield. Progress was slow and costly. The fighting lasted from early October into November. Only after the Scheldt was cleared and mines were removed could Antwerp finally begin receiving Allied shipping. The first major Allied convoy entered the port near the end of November. By then, the Red Ball Express had already done the job it had been created to do. On November 16, 1944, the Red Ball Express was officially shut down. The emergency route had run for 82 days. It had carried more than 400,000 tons of supplies. It had used thousands of trucks. It had depended on tens of thousands of drivers, mechanics, dispatchers, military police, loaders, and supply troops. And it had kept the American advance alive during one of the most dangerous logistical crises of the campaign. But it did not end the war. That is important to say. By the autumn of 1944, some Allied leaders and many soldiers hoped the war might end before Christmas. It did not. German resistance hardened along the frontier. The Siegfried Line slowed the advance. The weather worsened. Supply problems continued. The fighting became bitter again. Then, on December 16, 1944, the Germans attacked through the Ardennes. The offensive became known to Americans as the Battle of the Bulge. 3 German armies struck a thinly held sector of the American line. The attack surprised the Allies, shattered parts of the front, and drove a deep bulge into the American position. German armored columns pushed westward through forests, snow, fog, and confusion. Their goal was ambitious: split the Allied armies, seize Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into crisis. The plan failed, but the cost was enormous. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States Army in World War II. Roughly 19,000 Americans were killed, with tens of thousands more wounded, captured, or missing. Units such as the 106th Infantry Division and the 28th Infantry Division suffered terribly. At Malmedy, Waffen-SS troops murdered American prisoners. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division and other American units held out while surrounded. When the Germans demanded surrender, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied with one word: nuts. Patton's Third Army then performed one of the most famous operational maneuvers of the war. It turned north in winter conditions and drove toward Bastogne, helping break the siege on December 26. That movement required planning, discipline, fuel, and transport. The army that turned north in December had been shaped by the same logistical system that had kept it alive in September. The Red Ball Express was no longer running in its original form. But the lesson remained. Wars are not won only at the point of a bayonet. They are won on roads. They are won in depots. They are won by mechanics under trucks in the rain, by drivers fighting sleep at the wheel, by dispatchers tracking cargo, by engineers repairing bridges, by military police waving traffic through intersections, by laborers loading gasoline cans into truck beds until their hands bleed. The Red Ball Express did not make the Battle of the Bulge impossible. It did make the Allied army harder to stop. After the war, German officers tried to explain what had happened. Many had respected American firepower, but they had underestimated the deeper strength behind it. They understood armored warfare. They understood battlefield maneuver. They understood the danger of air power. What they had not fully understood was the scale at which the United States could supply a modern army far from home. American power was not only in its tanks. In fact, some German tanks were better armored and more heavily armed than the Sherman. American power was not only in individual battlefield skill. German officers often continued to believe, rightly or wrongly, that their own tactical training was superior. But the Americans could replace losses. They could build trucks by the hundreds of thousands. They could ship fuel across the Atlantic. They could repair ports. They could rebuild railways. They could create emergency road networks in days. They could feed armies, move hospitals, supply artillery, and keep vehicles running over distances that German planners had assumed would break any army. That was the shock. Not that the Americans advanced, but that they kept advancing. The Red Ball Express was one of the clearest examples of that difference. It showed that the American army could improvise under pressure and then support that improvisation with industrial depth. Other armies had improvised supply columns before. Other armies had used trucks. What made Red Ball different was scale, urgency, and endurance. It was not elegant. It was not perfectly organized. It wasted fuel. It destroyed vehicles. It exhausted men. It lost cargo. It caused accidents. It depended on drivers who were often treated unjustly by the very army they served. And still, it worked. That contradiction is part of the story. The American army in 1944 was powerful, but it was not fair. It fought for liberation in Europe while practicing segregation within its own ranks. It carried democratic language overseas while denying equal dignity to many of the soldiers wearing its uniform. Black soldiers drove through France under the American flag, delivering fuel to white combat units, while knowing that back home many of them could not vote freely, attend the schools they wanted, live where they wanted, or sit where they wanted on a bus. They knew the hypocrisy. They drove anyway. Some drove because they had been ordered to. Some drove because they wanted to defeat Hitler. Some drove because they believed service would strengthen the case for civil rights. Some drove because pride survives even inside injustice. Their reasons were personal. Their achievement was collective. The Red Ball Express became one of the great logistical operations of the war. Yet the men who made it work did not receive the fame given to tank commanders, fighter aces, airborne troops, or infantry divisions. There was no great national myth built around the truck drivers. No single monument captured the full scale of what they had done. Their work was remembered in official histories, in veterans' accounts, and eventually in books and documentaries, but for many years it remained a background story. Hollywood made a film called Red Ball Express in 1952. Like many war films of its era, it simplified the story and placed a white fictional officer at the center. Sidney Poitier appeared in a supporting role, but the real historical weight of black drivers was not given the central treatment it deserved. The film preserved the name. but not the full truth. The real Red Ball Express was not a story about one heroic captain. It was a story about thousands of exhausted men. It was a story about segregated truck companies carrying the burden of a supposedly modern army. It was a story about how logistics can decide the speed of history. It was a story about the difference between reaching a battlefield and being able to remain there. And it was a story about what happens when an army that seems stopped finds a way to keep moving. By the end of 1944, the Allied advance had slowed. The dream of ending the war by Christmas was gone. The Battle of the Bulge would bring winter, death, and doubt. But Germany was now fighting a war it could not sustain. Its fuels reserves were shrinking. Its cities were under air attack. Its factories were being bombed. Its armies were retreating in the east and west. The Red Army was approaching from the east. The Western Allies were building strength for the final crossing into Germany. In March 1945, American forces would cross the Rhine. In April, German resistance would collapse. In May, the war in Europe would end. When people imagine that victory, they often picture infantry crossing rivers, tanks rolling through German towns, flags raised over ruins, or prisoners marching with hands raised. But behind every one of those images stood the supply system. Behind the rifle was the ammunition truck. Behind the tank was the fuel convoy. Behind the artillery barrage was the road network. Behind the hospital tent was the medical supply chain. Behind the final advance into Germany were the men who had kept the armies alive when the pursuit across France nearly outran itself. Dwight Eisenhower later listed the 2.5-ton truck among the essential tools of Allied victory. That judgment was not sentimental, it was practical. Eisenhower understood that modern war was not simply a test of battlefield courage. It was a test of movement, production, transport, and organization. The bulldozer mattered. The Jeep mattered. The transport aircraft mattered. And the truck mattered. The truck was not glamorous, but it was everywhere. It carried food, fuel, shells, blankets, bridge parts, radio equipment, water cans, mail, prisoners, and wounded men. It carried the war forward. On the Red Ball Express, those trucks became the difference between a pursuit that died on the road and a pursuit that survived long enough to reach the German frontier. Imagine the route in the autumn of 1944, a road stretching east from Normandy. Military police at intersections, red discs painted on signs, doors, and tailgates. Convoys moving through darkness with hooded headlights. Drivers watching the dim light ahead of them, fighting sleep, gripping the wheel, smelling gasoline and hot oil, the truck bed behind them loaded beyond regulation, the engine straining, the road rough beneath the tires. Somewhere ahead, a tank unit waits for fuel. Somewhere behind, another convoy is already loading. The driver does not know the whole map. He knows the next turn. He knows the truck ahead. He knows that if he stops too long, someone at the front may stop too. That is logistics at human scale. It is easy to speak of 400,000 tons. It is harder to imagine one gasoline can, one crate, one tire, one driver's hands, one night without sleep, one truck sliding on a wet road, one man crawling under an engine with a flashlight, one military policeman standing in the rain and waving the column through, one mechanic stripping parts from a broken vehicle to keep another moving. History often remembers decisions made by generals, but decisions only matter if someone can carry them out. Patton could order an advance, Bradley could shift priorities, Eisenhower could choose strategy, Montgomery could propose an operation, Model could estimate the Allied supply problem. But none of those decisions moved a single gallon of gasoline by itself. The gasoline moved because drivers moved it. That is why the Red Ball Express matters. It turns the abstract idea of logistics into something visible. It shows that supply is not a background detail. It is the condition that makes every battle possible. Without it, courage starves, armor stops, artillery falls silent, victory pauses at the roadside. In late August 1944, the German command believed the Americans had reached the natural limit of their offensive. By the traditional rules of war, that belief made sense. The Americans were far from their base, their railways were broken, their ports were limited, their fuel demand was enormous. Then the Americans created a road system that ran almost without rest for 82 days. It did not completely defeat the problem, but it changed the equation, and that was enough. The Red Ball Express was born from crisis, built in haste, driven by exhausted men, and remembered too little. It was messy, dangerous, unequal, and indispensable. It carried the American army through the gap between the breakout from Normandy and the opening of Antwerp. It helped preserve momentum when momentum might have died. The German generals had expected distance to stop the Americans. They underestimated the trucks, they underestimated the drivers, they underestimated the factories behind them, and they underestimated the ability of a flawed, segregated, democratic army to improvise its way through a crisis. The road from Normandy to the front is quiet now. Many of its wartime signs are gone. The towns have been rebuilt. Fields that once held burned vehicles now grow crops. The roar of convoys has disappeared into memory. But for 82 days in 1944, that road carried the weight of an army. It carried gasoline to tanks. It carried shells to guns. It carried food to soldiers. It carried the hopes of commanders who feared the pursuit would stop, and it carried the labor of men whose names were rarely written down. A red disc on a truck door meant priority. A red ball meant move first. Do not stop, do not delay. The war is waiting. And somewhere in the darkness of France, a tired driver keeps his eyes on the dim red light ahead of him, shifts the truck into gear, and drives east.